What would you do if one day your little sister's boyfriend spat on a dish you had spent the entire day preparing? I found myself in that exact situation. That dish wasn't just the result of hard work. It reflected my pride and reputation as the sous-chef of a five-star fine dining restaurant. But what hurt me the most wasn't the insult itself, it was my sister's reaction. After witnessing that blatant act of disrespect, she turned to me and said, "Don't make a big deal out of it." From that moment on, something inside me cracked. It wasn't just my pride, it was the bond between siblings, something I once believed nothing could ever break. Listen to this story and find out how I taught him and my sister a lesson they won't forget. Hello, everyone. My name is Aurora. I'm 27 years old and live alone in an apartment at the Louisa, steps away from Jameson Square Park. Every morning when I wake up, the first thing that comes to mind is the sound of a knife hitting the cutting board, the soft hiss of the stove, and the smell of broth just beginning to simmer. I'm the sous chef at Ether, a five-star fine dining restaurant in the Pearl District of Portland. Every evening, my team and I work behind closed stainless steel doors, where there's no small talk or laughter, only the rhythm of blades, the roar of flame, and the ticking countdown of service. We cook dishes that diners finish in 10 minutes. But crafting the right flavors can take 10 years of learning, trial, and error. I live by discipline, love my craft, and am not much of a talker. Loud parties and messy relationships aren't my thing. To me, a perfect day is one where I get to handle fresh ingredients, trim them with care, cook with focus, and see a guest smile when their dish is placed in front of them. From the outside, my life probably looks dull, but to me, it's a world full of color, a space where I get to be exactly who I am. I used to believe everything would be fine if I stuck to my rhythm. All I had to do was focus on my job, steer clear of drama, and nothing too bad would ever happen. But it turns out the very love I had for the kitchen, for every dish I poured my heart into, was the thing that slowly pulled me away from the people I cared about most, especially Taylor, my younger sister. She's 3 years younger than I am, and I was always the first to protect her whenever something went wrong. My story began on a night over a year ago, a seemingly simple family dinner at my parents' house in Beaverton. That evening, Taylor brought someone special with her boyfriend. And like always, I agreed to cook for the occasion, just like I do for every meaningful family gathering. I thought dinner would be a warm, casual evening, a chance for Taylor to introduce the man she loved proudly. But I never imagined that very meal would be the thing to fracture the bond between us as siblings. And somehow everything spiraled in a way I still can't fully understand, starting from a place none of us could have ever seen coming. I still remember that evening clearly. The whole family, Steve and Joe, had gathered in the living room of my parents' old house. The space was just like it had always been, simple but warm. Nothing extravagant, enough to make you feel at ease and at home. A week earlier, Taylor had called me, sounding excited. She said she was bringing her boyfriend home for the first time, and if I could help cook dinner, it would make the whole night even more special. Right after that call, my mom texted me. She wrote, "Help your sister with dinner. Your cooking's always so good." That alone was enough to make me smile. I truly believed it would be a cozy little gathering where I could do my part to make the evening just right. Taylor told me she didn't need anything too fancy, just something neat, thoughtful, and put together. But her eyes lit up with pride every time she mentioned her boyfriend, mainly when she used a word I couldn't ignore, class. To me, just seeing her smile like she used to, still the little sister who used to hide behind my back when the other kids picked on her, still the girl who once whispered that I was the best big sister in the world. That made every bit of effort I put into that dinner completely worth it. When Taylor brought her boyfriend home, I started prepping ingredients early. I chose a 3-course menu following the proper structure of a complete fine dining experience. The appetizer was a kale salad tossed with Meyer lemon and crumbled goat cheese. Light, refreshing, the perfect way to begin the meal. Next came the main course, pan-seared Wagyu beef, drizzled with a rich red wine, demi-glace, that had been reduced for hours. I sliced each piece evenly, carefully managing the temperature to lock in the natural moisture and sweetness of the meat. For dessert, I made a dark chocolate mousse. I added a finely grated orange zest for a fragrant base, sprinkled a pinch of sea salt, and served it with fresh strawberries. I believed that I'd make Taylor feel proud in front of her boyfriend with these dishes. As I cooked, I smiled to myself, happy. I had no idea that those very dishes would become the thing that cracked our relationship. Chad, Taylor's boyfriend, showed up as I set the table that night. He brought an expensive bottle of wine, shook my dad's hand politely, and handed my mom a gift with just the right amount of confidence. When I first saw Chad, I thought maybe my sister was lucky. He spoke with charm, dressed neatly, and carried himself well. A guy like that, I figured, would probably give Taylor the sense of security she deserved. But that thought started to shift just a few minutes after the appetizer was served. While we were waiting for the main course, Taylor was busy showing off the gifts Chad had given her. She told the family, "Chad likes everything to be just right." Hearing her say that, I didn't respond. I just kept working in the kitchen. It's what I do. Part of the job, part of who I am. A little later, while I was tasting the sauce for the main course, she came up beside me. I don't know what she was trying to prove, but she leaned in and said softly, "Make sure it's seasoned just right, okay? Chad's particular." I froze for a second when she said that, not because it was rude, but because of how she said it. Gently, but with an expectation that I would bend to the taste of someone I'd never even met. After a brief pause, I nodded and went back to work. The kitchen was small, but my mind felt wide open, like I had to mentally step back to see the whole picture. At the dinner table, Taylor was the first to raise her glass. She thanked me for cooking the meal, but the way she said it made it feel more like she was introducing a product than acknowledging something her sister had prepared. Still, I smiled and said nothing. In this profession, I've gotten used to people who come to fine dining restaurants not to enjoy the food, but to affirm their status through what's on their plate. But what I didn't see coming was that the meal I put my heart into would be treated with such disrespect, all because of the pride of a man who knew nothing about cooking. After the appetizer, the mood around the table began to warm up. Chad leaned back in his chair, poured more wine, and told everyone about his real estate business. He talked about big deals in Lake Oswego and luxury townhome projects he was consulting on. His words flowed smoothly, a little showy, but still wrapped in a polite exterior. As Chad spoke, Taylor sat next to him, her eyes gleaming like she could see her entire future unfolding in his every word. She chimed in occasionally, nodding along with each detail he shared. My parents kept smiling throughout. I couldn't tell whether they were genuinely impressed or simply being polite to the man their daughter cared about. While he boasted, I stayed silent, just listening while swapping out plates to get ready for the main course. As I placed the Wagyu beef in front of each person, I thought everything would stay pleasant if this dinner went smoothly. I still believed that until Chad tapped his fork into the meat, took a bite, and frowned. With a flat, detached tone, he said, "Salty, not what I'd expect from fine dining." The moment he spoke, Taylor cut off a small piece, tasted it, then looked at me with hesitant eyes. A second later, she gave a slight nod and added quietly, "He's susceptible to flavor. It is a bit salty." Hearing their comments, I couldn't tell what made my throat tighten more, the dish's taste, or how they dismissed my work with just a few words. But I didn't react right away. Instead, I quietly picked up a spoon, tasted the sauce again, and replied in a low, calm voice. "This is a signature dish at my restaurant. The recipe hasn't changed in 3 years, but people's taste usually reflects where they grew up." As soon as I said that, I saw Chad's eyes darken. He lowered his wine glass, tilted his head slightly, and smiled dryly. He didn't say another word, but he didn't have to. I could see it clearly in his eyes, a challenge. A few seconds after that awkward look in his eyes, Chad started bragging about how many countries he'd been to and how he tasted high-end dishes at world-renowned restaurants. He claimed he wasn't trying to show off and was offering constructive feedback. But the way he emphasized his words and glanced at the plate of meat said the exact opposite. The mood at the table began to dip. My mom looked down at her lap. Taylor pressed her lips together, holding Chad's hand under the table. My dad quietly set down his knife and let out a soft breath. Then, with a calm voice, he turned to Chad and said, "If it doesn't suit your taste, you can set it aside. In this family, meals are about sharing, not judging what's right or wrong." His words were gentle enough not to stir more tension, but each one landed with weight. A clear reminder to Chad that he had just crossed the line of respect. Moments later, in a voice just loud enough for the two of them, Taylor leaned in and whispered, trying to smooth things over, "Just eat, okay? Don't make a thing out of it." Seeing how uncomfortable everyone had become, I didn't feel the need to say anything else. I didn't have to argue to defend my dish. To me, taste is a reflection of lived experience and cultural background. There's no right or wrong, no absolute standard or hierarchy. A dish might not suit someone's palate. That doesn't make it any less valuable. A little while later, I stood up, walked into the kitchen, and grabbed a few extra napkins. I thought maybe it was best just to let everything pass in silence. But before I could return to the table, Chad's next move shattered every last limit inside me. With a slow, cold voice, he said, "My taste buds can't handle something like this." And then, without warning, he lowered his head and spat directly onto the meat on his plate. No heads up, no hesitation, just a quiet, calculated act of pure contempt. For several seconds after he did it, the room went completely still. And me, I just stood there feeling like something inside me had cracked and fallen apart without making a sound. I've dealt with picky diners before. I've heard harsher criticisms than that. But never, not in a restaurant or in life, had anyone ever done something like that to my food. And what Chad did, it wasn't about taste anymore. It wasn't about right or wrong. It was outright humiliation, not just toward the dish, but toward who I am. Chad didn't have to insult me with words, because his action alone was a slap in the face without needing any sound. And what hurt me the most wasn't Chad's disrespect. It was the silent look in my sister's eyes. The way she avoided mine, like she no longer saw the sister standing right in front of her, and I knew this couldn't be ignored. The air in the room grew heavier by the second, with the clinking of silverware coming to a complete stop and glances darting without a single word spoken. I clenched my fists, took a step forward, and asked Chad directly, "Tell me, what the hell are you doing?" Immediately, Taylor shot up from her seat, her face flushed with embarrassment and panic. In a sharp, frantic voice, she blurted out, "Stop it! Don't make a big deal out of this." At that moment, my mom jumped in too, her voice soft, almost pleading as she said, "He's your sister's guest. Can't you just let it go?" I turned to look at her, and in that moment, my eyes weren't those of a daughter, hoping her mother would take her side. They were the eyes of a woman who couldn't understand why something so clearly wrong was being excused. Since Taylor was born, I'd held back. I had stayed quiet through countless small things in this house. But if my sister brought home a boyfriend who acted like that during a family dinner in front of our parents, then it was no longer just her business. And I couldn't pretend it didn't matter. By then I was ready to step forward, and if I had to, I would have slammed my fist right into his face. But before I could take another move, a familiar voice cut through the room. "Enough. Sit down." That single sentence brought all of us to a halt. I quickly sat down and turned my eyes toward the voice. It was my father, Steve, a man who once served as a homicide detective with the Portland Police Department. He was never the type to raise his voice and certainly never flaunted his authority. He was firm but composed, cold at times, but always a listener. Throughout our childhood, he never yelled at me or Taylor, but whenever he did speak, no one dared to keep standing. After the tempers in the room had started to cool, my dad turned to Taylor. He asked her, "Was there something wrong with the food?" Taylor kept her head down as he spoke. She mumbled quietly in response, "Maybe it's just a matter of taste." Without saying another word, my dad looked over at Chad, but his gaze had shifted. It was no longer soft. It was sharp, like he was stripping away that expensive suit jacket and staring straight through to what was underneath. In a slow, clear voice, he asked, "Do you always go around making people feel small like that?" The question landed like a blade of cold steel, slicing right through the silence at the dinner table. Chad frowned. The polished mask he'd worn since the evening started to crack. His face twisted with anger, the kind of anger that comes from someone who's not used to being confronted or hearing things they don't want to hear. With a bitter, unfiltered tone, Chad snapped back, "Are you threatening me?" My dad didn't flinch. His face stayed calm, eyes locked in, as if he was reading every flicker of reaction on Chad's face. Then, with that same steady tone, he replied, "I'm just telling the truth. If you can't handle that, feel free to get up and walk out." The moment he finished speaking, Taylor jumped in. Her voice wasn't steady like usual. It trembled, clearly shaken, maybe from fear of losing the man she loved, or perhaps because she never expected her father to push back this hard. She looked at him with watery eyes, trying to stay composed, but the emotion cracked through as she said, "Dad, please don't do this. He's my boyfriend." My dad turned to her. He didn't yell. He didn't raise his voice, but the look in his eyes silenced the room. And then, in a low, heavy voice, like a hammer hitting the table, he said, "You shut your mouth." Taylor froze. I saw her hand tighten on the table's edge, her fingertips turning pale from pressing into her palm. But this time, she didn't talk back, unlike usual. Maybe because she realized Dad wasn't playing. Unlike Taylor, Chad had no intention of staying in my parents' house. After my dad told her to shut her mouth, he stood up, pushing his chair back with his heel, the movement deliberately loud. Then, with a face that no longer bothered to hide his contempt, he turned and walked toward the door. But just before stepping out, he paused for a moment, looked back, and tossed out a line dripping with disdain. "This family is a joke." My dad didn't look at him as he walked away. Instead, he said, "You say one more word, and I'll personally kick your ass out of this house." His voice was low, firm, but so cold that I swore the windows in the room trembled for a second. Chad froze for a beat after hearing those words. Then he quickly walked out, his footsteps echoing sharply across the heavy silence. As Chad left, Taylor panicked. I saw her body move toward the door on reflex, but before she could reach the handle, my dad's voice rang out again. "Don't move! You step out that door, don't bother coming back." Taylor froze in place. Her shoulders trembled. One hand rose to cover her mouth. Her eyes locked onto the half-open door in front of her. But this time, she didn't take another step. After Chad left, the atmosphere in our living room collapsed into silence. My dad remained in his seat, his expression unchanged. But seconds later, my sister did something that broke through even his calm. Taylor turned back around. Her eyes were still red, but her voice didn't shake. Looking straight at our father, equal parts angry and hurt, she said, "Because of you, he walked out. If Chad leaves me, I'll never forgive you." My dad didn't respond. His face stayed still, but I noticed his fingers tighten slightly on the table, as if holding something back, keeping his temper from rising again. A few seconds after lashing out at him, Taylor turned to me. Her eyes burned with frustration and grief as she snapped, "You're the one who blew everything up. If you hadn't taken it so far, we'd still have dinner like normal people." Hearing those words, I couldn't hold it in anymore. I slammed the napkin onto the table. The sound wasn't loud, but it hit like a slap to the face. In that dead silence, my voice came out, shaking with anger as I shouted, "I gave up one of my rare days off for you. I spent the entire morning making sure every dish was perfect to celebrate you bringing your boyfriend home. And now you look at me and say I'm the one who ruined it?" The moment I finished speaking, Taylor lifted her head, her eyes cold, her voice sharp and dripping with bitterness like she was spitting every word back at me. "You think you matter that much? Who asked you to help? If you hadn't cooked, he would have just taken me to a restaurant instead." As those words landed, I felt something inside my chest crack. Not because of what she said, but because it came from her, the one person I always believed, no matter what happened, I'd stand by. I clenched my fists beneath the table and said nothing. My mind was blank except for one unspoken question, echoing louder than anything else. Has she completely lost her mind? Amid the shouting match between my sister and me, my mom finally spoke up, trying to ease the tension. Her voice was soft, but clear enough to cut through everything. "She's just hurt. Don't be too harsh on your sister." The moment my mom finished, Taylor turned to her. Her eyes were still wet, but her voice shot up sharp and resentful as she snapped, "This family has never given me anything." Her words made my dad lift his head immediately. His eyes, no longer cold, had started to burn red with anger. His voice dropped low and firm as he repeated each word like a blow. "What did you just say? I've raised you for over 20 years, gave you food, educated you, and now you stand here and say this family gave you nothing?" Taylor stepped back slightly at his tone, but didn't back down. Her stare was defiant, mixed with the hurt of someone who didn't know whether they were fighting for love or just lashing out at the only people who had ever stood by her. I couldn't tell if she was blinded by love or if all this time she had never truly understood what family meant. Her voice trembled, but she forced it steady as she looked directly at our father and said, "That's right. Only Chad cares about my future. Only he truly values me." After that, the room fell silent again. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because no one had the will to say anything anymore. A long moment passed. Then my dad slowly stood up. He didn't look at Taylor. He didn't glance at me. Without a word, he quietly pushed his chair back and said, "Then let me show you what it feels like to be given nothing." And with that, he turned and walked upstairs, not saying another word. And from the moment he left the room, I knew the cracks in this family had finally started to show. While Taylor and I were still locked in a stare filled with anger and betrayal, our mother gently stepped forward and reached out, trying to pull us closer together. But a few seconds later, the very thing Taylor had never known how to protect also left her. The same way Chad had walked out of this house, cold and without a single glance back, we suddenly heard a loud crash from upstairs, followed by the sharp, unmistakable sound of glass shattering. I knew something was wrong at that moment, and Taylor felt it too. We both rushed up toward the noise, and what we saw left me speechless. Inside Taylor's room, the one our father had spent an entire month redesigning to match her tastes, everything was in ruins, like a storm had ripped through it. The MacBook he had gifted her after graduation, a symbol of his support as she began her career, was now lying on the floor with its screen completely shattered. Expensive perfume bottles, some bought by him, others gifted by me, with saved-up bonuses, were smashed to pieces in the bathroom sink. Beside them, a large trash bag had been ripped apart, its contents strewn across the floor. But it didn't end there. Her designer clothes, the ones Dad used to take her shopping for every weekend, were scattered across the lawn outside. He had thrown every piece out the window with his bare hands. As soon as Taylor saw the scene, she screamed, "What are you doing?" Dad turned around at her voice, his eyes still burning with anger. He replied, "You said this family never gave you anything. I'm just showing you what nothing looks like." Taylor stumbled back and froze in the doorway. I couldn't tell if it was the shock, the heartbreak, or finally realizing just how deeply she'd hurt him. A few seconds later, Dad stepped forward, looked her dead in the eye, and said, "If you choose him, walk out that door and don't return. Because if this were the old me, that man would have never made it through our front gate." Before things could spiral any further, my mother grabbed Taylor's hand. Through her tears, she pleaded, "Say sorry to your father, please. You were wrong, Taylor. Don't let it come to this." But years of being spoiled had shaped Taylor into someone too stubborn to back down. She yanked her hand free from our mother's grip, dragged her suitcase into the center of the room, and began stuffing the last of her clothes into a bag. With a voice trembling but full of defiance, she shouted, "No need to kick me out. I'll leave on my own." My father didn't move. He didn't stop her. Taylor had once been the great love of his life. When we were kids, he'd hug her first every time he came home from a shift. Not me. Before he even took off his shoes, he'd look for her to kiss her on the cheek. To him, Taylor had been something sacred, irreplaceable. I used to think if I ever had a daughter, I'd love her the way my dad loved Taylor. But watching him turn his face away that night, I knew his disappointment had grown larger than the love he once held for her. As Taylor wheeled her suitcase toward the hallway, our mother kept holding on to her arm, then turned to me and begged, "Help her! Where will she even go now?" For a moment I stood there numb. Then with a dry, quiet voice I said, "Let her go. Let her learn the world outside isn't like this house." And when the door finally opened and Taylor rolled her suitcase out of our home, I saw a tear slide down her cheek. She didn't look back, but I knew she would because Taylor is my sister, and more than anyone else I know, that man never truly loved her. After Taylor left the house, my father quietly returned to his room. He didn't say another word, but I knew something inside him had broken completely. I stayed behind to clean the table, wiping away the splashes from a dinner that never really happened. Before I exited that house, I saw my mother standing silently by the kitchen counter, her eyes cast down to the tiled floor, as if she had drifted off somewhere far away. My mother was never one to show much. She's the kind of person who keeps the house smelling faintly of cinnamon and orange peel, who knew which blanket I liked on cold nights and which mug I used every morning. When I was younger and came home late from school, there was always a portion of food waiting for me in the fridge, along with a neatly written note. "Heat this, honey. I left some pastries in the oven, too." She was the one who kept this house steady through all the years my father was away for work. Never raised her voice, never let anyone see her tired. To her, love didn't come in words. It came in knowing where everything belonged, cooking meals warm enough, and sitting beside us quietly while we talked, even when she already knew every part of the story. But tonight, as she watched Taylor disappear behind that door, I knew she understood something too. That it was our love, too soft, too abundant, that had raised a daughter unprepared for the weight of the real world. On the drive back to my apartment, I drove silently, letting my thoughts drift as far as the road ahead. That night, I sat alone in my living room, surrounded by 4 cold, quiet walls, replaying every glance, every word from the dinner that had just unraveled everything. I didn't know that somewhere else, my sister had gone looking for comfort from Chad, hoping for reassurance. But what she got wasn't a warm embrace. It was cruel, sharp, and humiliating. He told her she wasn't worthy of someone with his status. He accused her of loving him for his money. He even dragged our entire family into it, mocking us like we were some stain on his perfect life. I wasn't there to see it. I didn't witness how many tears she cried in front of him. All I know is this. The next morning, I was woken by a storm of sound, the phone ringing nonstop, the doorbell echoing down the hallway, and fists pounding against my door like they were trying to break through my chest. When I opened it, there she was, Taylor. Her face was soaked with tears, her eyes swollen and red, as if she hadn't slept at all. I stepped aside so she could come in. But instead of walking through, she collapsed right there on the floor, arms wrapped around her shoulders, sobbing, the kind of sob that only comes when someone's lost the last thing they thought they could hold on to. I sat beside her. She didn't say anything yet. She hadn't even reached out when she suddenly looked up at me, eyes still wet, but voice filled with blame. "You're the reason I got kicked out. This apartment, it's mine now." I stared at her for a long time as she cried herself out. If this had been a few days ago, maybe I would have opened the door, prepped the guest room, even made her a cup of coffee. But now, after everything, I realized something. If I kept shielding her, she'd never grow. She was 23. What she needed wasn't a place to hide. It was a reason to take responsibility. I knew she didn't have enough to cover rent. All her income had been drained into clothes, makeup, parties, and Instagram photos that looked better than her reality. I wasn't angry. I just stood up quietly, looked down at her, and said, "You're trespassing in my space. Get out before I call the cops." The second I mentioned the police, Taylor snapped. She screamed, hurled a pillow against the wall, and slammed her fists over and over into the side of the couch. Then she pointed at me with a furious glare and shouted, "You've had everything your whole life. You have no idea what it feels like to be thrown out on the street." I didn't answer. I just pulled out my phone and dialed. A few minutes later, the doorbell rang again. 2 officers stood outside, stern but respectful. They asked Taylor to gather her things and leave the apartment. She didn't say a word, just pulled her suitcase across the hallway in silence. There was no goodbye, only the quiet shake of her shoulders as she walked out. And when everyone had turned their backs, only then did she realize the one person who had truly taught her how to stand on her own wasn't her boyfriend, wasn't even her sister. It was our father, the man she once believed would forgive her no matter what. After Taylor left my place, she didn't return to our parents' house like everyone had hoped. I only received one message from her best friend letting me know she was staying somewhere temporary. She needed time to think everything through, and to me, that was the best decision she could have made. Not to escape, but to finally learn how to look at herself honestly for the first time. I thought Chad would disappear from my life like a foul gust of wind, the kind that blows through a family dinner and leaves behind nothing but a bad smell. But I was wrong. Just 1 week later, while my father still sat silently for hours in the living room, while my mother still called every day to ask if Taylor had made contact, he showed up right where I worked, at a white linen table under soft lights with a glass of wine in hand. That evening, Ether was hosting a VIP group. On the reservation list, Michael Remington, a well-known investment executive, accompanied by a few associates. When they walked in, I was buried in prep and barely glanced at the guests. Not until the main course, the Wagyu beef with red wine reduction, was served. A server slipped into the kitchen, leaned in, and whispered, "Table 3 is impressed with the Wagyu." They asked, "Who's running the kitchen?" I nodded, wiped my hands, straightened my chef's jacket, and walked through the familiar stainless steel doors. As I approached the table, my eyes instinctively met the gaze of the man seated across from Michael. Something caught in my chest. It was Chad. He sat upright, legs crossed with confidence, a silver fork in hand, as he cut a perfect bite of beef and brought it to his mouth. He chewed slowly, as if weighing each flavor layer, then nodded and turned to the person beside him. He said, "Perfect. Well done." Michael smiled, clearly pleased. He added with a nod, "I like how the sauce is handled here. Smooth, but still carries depth." I stopped beside the table, nodded politely, keeping the composure expected of a professional chef. But beneath the calm, I understood something. Some people never change unless life finally makes them pay for their arrogance. I smiled calmly, looked at Chad, and asked, "Evening. This dish ring a bell?" Chad froze the moment he saw me. The smile on his face stiffened midair. Michael glanced between us, curiosity rising, and asked, "You two know each other?" I didn't answer. I returned to the locker room, and pulled out my phone. Then I returned to the table. My hands were steady as I opened a video I'd saved from that night. I sat alone in my old apartment the night after that tear-stained dinner at my parents' house. Frame by frame, I'd recorded that evening, not out of revenge, but as a reminder to myself that if something isn't remembered, the world has a way of pretending it never happened. I hadn't saved that clip to get back at anyone. It was a lesson, a quiet message that no matter who you are, whether you're in the kitchen or at the table, respect is never optional. I didn't expect that tonight it would finally matter. The moment the video ended, Michael remained silent. His expression didn't shift, but his eyes grew noticeably colder with every frame. The air thickened, a dense, quiet weight, hanging between the soft lighting and the distant clink of silverware from nearby tables. A few seconds passed before Chad finally spoke, trying to maintain his composure. "That video doesn't prove anything. Could have been edited. She might be trying to slander me for personal reasons." I didn't react right away. I just looked at him steady, unwavering, and replied in a low, even voice, "If needed, I can call the police, and then the truth will speak louder than any excuse." The moment I mentioned the police, Chad flinched. He turned to Michael, trying to appear calm, but the forced smile on his face betrayed him. In a tone meant to reclaim control, he said, "This is a personal matter. It doesn't affect work." Silence hovered over the table. Michael didn't respond at first, but seconds later, with his usual calm, he gently placed his napkin on the table. Then he looked up, and this time his gaze was razor sharp. He spoke slowly, clearly to Chad. "You're wrong. To me, a dish reflects the character of the person behind it, and anyone who disrespects that has no place on my team." And with no hesitation, he turned fully to Chad. His voice was no longer polite. Every word was precise, final. "As of tomorrow, your contract is terminated for gross misconduct and ethical violations." Chad froze. He started to shift as if to stand up and protest, but before he could, I looked straight at him and said, "Taste can be trained. Character? Not everyone learns that." I didn't stay to see what happened next. I turned and strolled back toward the kitchen. My footsteps melted into the crackling of the flames, the clang of pans, and the aroma of sauce still simmering, waiting for me to return. Behind me, no one said a word because there was nothing left to say. Some failures don't need to be shouted over a crowd. You play them and let the truth speak for itself. That night, when I got back to my apartment after a long day, it was already late. I was changing out of my clothes when the phone rang. It was Taylor. Her voice was hoarse, probably from days of crying and sleepless nights. But what made me go still wasn't her tone. It was the long silence between her words. She said she'd thought everything through. She said she wanted to come home. And then after a few seconds of hesitation, she spoke in a small, almost confessing voice. "Can you come pick me up?" I didn't ask any questions. I didn't need an explanation. I just replied with a single quiet sentence, enough for her to know I was still here. "I'll come in the morning." I knew it was time for Taylor to face what she'd spent years avoiding. Finally. And it was also time for our family to open the last door, not out of anger, but with a kind of love that had once been wounded, yet never truly left. The next morning when I arrived, Taylor was already waiting under the awning, outside her best friend's house. She rushed over the moment she saw me, tears pouring down her face. She didn't say much. She just broke down and held on to me, like she was afraid that if she let go, the whole world would collapse again. Through her sobs, she said, "I waited for you all night. I was so scared that I wouldn't know where to go if you didn't show up." I didn't respond. I just reached up, gently ruffled her hair, then opened the car door. Looking at her pale face, her noticeably thinner frame, I didn't need to hear anything else because maybe for the first time in her life, the past 10 days had taught her how to face herself. As the car turned into the narrow alley leading home, I saw my father sitting on the wooden chair outside the porch. He sat silently, eyes fixed on the gate. My mother had come out too, a dish towel still in her hand. They didn't say a word, just stood there waiting, the way they always had whenever we returned home from somewhere far away. Taylor stepped out of the car, entered the yard, and suddenly broke down. She ran straight to my mother, throwing herself into her arms like a child, sobbing. She cried out, "Mom, I'm sorry. I was wrong. I'm so sorry." My mother didn't say anything. She just held her, gently rocking her in the quiet, instinctive way mothers do with daughters who've lost their way. My father stepped closer too. He placed a hand on Taylor's shoulder, giving it a firm, steady squeeze. No words were spoken, but that alone was enough for me to know our family was coming back together. But not even 30 minutes later, just as I was about to gather my things and head out, a loud noise exploded at the front gate. The screech of tires, a slammed car door, and then a furious voice that echoed through the street. "Aurora, you ruined my life. $500,000 gone because of your filthy little stunt." I shot up, heart pounding, his words slamming straight into my chest. My fists clenched, ready to storm out and settle this, even if it meant we'd both end up in a police station. But before I could even step toward the door, a sharp, commanding whistle rang out from the porch. It was my father. The sound was crisp, short, and unmistakable. And right after it, Rex came charging out from the side of the house. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He sprinted toward the gate with the unwavering focus of a trained sentinel. Rex was the dog my father had raised in his days on the force. He was old now, but he had never lost his instinct to know precisely who belonged and who needed to leave. My father never took his eyes off Chad. His voice was calm and flat, almost emotionless, as he looked down at Rex and said, "Do your job, buddy." Rex understood instantly. He didn't attack. He just positioned himself right beside Chad's legs and let out a low, rumbling growl from deep in his chest. That alone was enough. Chad stumbled back, tripping over the patch of grass near the gate. He stammered something incoherent, then spun around, scrambled into his car, and sped off, not once looking back. I didn't need to do a thing, because the one who stood there, the one who guarded the final line, the boundary no one was allowed to cross, he was still standing. And that man, it was my father. And today, exactly 1 year after the dinner that changed everything, Taylor is now a mother. Her baby, whose name is Troy, just turned 5 months old. He's the result of a broken love story between my sister and the man who once nearly tore our family apart. Just a few days after she came home, when Taylor found out she was pregnant, she stood in front of our father and said with unwavering certainty, "I'll raise my child on my own. I don't need him." The next day, she packed her things, moved out, and started her own life. She found a job, rented a small apartment, and began handling everything with her monthly paycheck. Watching her juggle the chaos of single motherhood, nights where she'd be so exhausted she'd fall asleep holding Troy in a chair, I could only stand quietly behind her, along with our parents. I became one of the people always ready to step in when she needed help. Because for the first time in her life, my sister had learned to live with responsibility. Since Troy arrived, our parents have changed too. Lighter, happier evenings at home are no longer filled with talk of the past. Now they're filled with stories of baby laughter, tiny hands reaching out, and the sparkle in a pair of curious eyes. To my parents, Troy is the most beautiful thing left behind after everything we lost. As for me, I'm still where I've always belonged. In the kitchen, still in love with the smoke, the sauce, the sound of oil bubbling in the pan. But now, beyond the work, there's something else I look forward to. A familiar guest who sits in the corner every night, always orders the dish I make, and waits for me after closing so we can walk out of the restaurant together into the quiet night. If there's one thing I want to leave you with from this story, it's this. Family isn't always perfect, and love doesn't always go as we hope. But if we choose to live with kindness, if we hold on to our softness even through the hardest moments, then love will find its way back. Slowly, maybe, but honestly, and just enough to keep the people we care about close. That's the end of my story. But before I close it, I want to ask you something. Was I wrong to speak up and defend my work and dignity? Was I wrong to let my sister walk away so she could learn a lesson our family couldn't teach her? And was I wrong to believe that love, even in family, sometimes needs boundaries, not just affection? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for listening. Until next time.